But there was just a few years ago. But I remembered even then the doors sometimes wouldn't open. When you went up and tried to get in, the doors wouldn't open. What was it lacking? Foundation. When you look, it was just Kmart, just like any other place anywhere else. It was just a Kmart. And you went in, you shopped. But they found the problems years later. And it was so severe that there was no correcting it. And now nothing can be built there at all. I don't know if ever there will be. Do you see the importance of the foundation? If we do not have a foundation with God, I don't care what the facade is. You can make a building look good for a little while, but eventually that lack of foundation is going to show up. And the bad thing is many times it goes for years before the little cracks begin to show. And I'm talking now spiritually, dads, in our lives. We can go and put up this good facade for a period of time. Our children are on the receiving end of having known the reality of our lives. Because I've talked to people even in the last few days. They have a church life, they have a public life, and they have a private life. And they're not the same. They're not the same person. And I'm going to tell you today that if, Dad, when you go out and go to work, that's probably one of the biggest things there is men who work. In fact, one of those verses, I think we talk about it, you get up early and you stay up late, and you eat the bread of sorrows. We talked in Sunday school this morning about guys who say, boy, I can't wait to get 65, and I'm going to retire. And at 66, they're burying them. You know how often that happens? Their world was their work, and when they lose that, they say, I don't have anything to do. I don't have a reason to live. Because they have not connected with their families. They have not connected with other things. Wow. So, is it a waste to get up early and stay up late? No, I know that reality. But I'm telling you, you got to make some time. You've got to make some time. You got to have some priorities. And some of you men in this room need to probably sit down. Don't do your list. And do I tell this every Father's Day? Probably. But it's good enough to use one more time, would you think? Bill McCartney. How many of you know who I'm talking about? Bill McCartney. I have my glasses on. I can't even see your hand. Sorry, but Bill McCartney, if this helps you any, they just bailed out to the Pac-10. Colorado, the Buffs run for the coast. We won't go there. Most of you don't care. Iowa State still has somewhere to play football. That's all that's important. So, if that's important, we need to discuss priorities. Bill McCartney was the coach of the Colorado Buffaloes. The Colorado Buffaloes were number 1 in the nation. And I've heard him tell this story, and it's hilarious. But it just put it in perspective from him, that he was out on the practice field one day and said one of his associate coaches ran across the field. Coach McCartney, ESPN's on the phone. ESPN, probably going to do an interview. And he takes off running across the practice field, goes under the stadium, goes up into his office, grabs the phone and says, this is Coach McCartney. They said, Coach McCartney, this is ESPN. Your magazine subscription's about to run out. Did you want to renew that? He said, kind of really helped me realize that I wasn't really all that important as I thought I was. But he thought, boy, when you're the national champion coach of the best football team in the country, your world, you've arrived. There's nowhere else to go. What do you do? And he said for a few weeks and even months, he lived in that little aura of I'm the best there is, and I've coached the best there is, and all that stuff. And he tells the story of sitting in a church and that the preacher preached a sermon. It might have been Father's Day, in fact, now that I'm thinking about it. And he told those men that if you think you've got it all together, look over at your wife. And if her eyes do not affirm to you what you think, you better check it out. And Bill McCartney said, I turned very confidently, looked my wife in the face, expecting that glow to come from her, and that just can't hardly believe I'm sitting here with you look. And he said when he looked at his wife, her eyes went down. She couldn't look him in the eyes. And her countenance fell. And he knew she was not nearly as happy to be sitting by Bill McCartney as Bill McCartney was to be him. And he said he went home that day, sat down and looked his wife in the eyes and says, "Tell me what kind of man I really am." And as she began to unfold to him the kind of man she perceived him to be, he quit coaching college football, walked away from that, because he said, if I've made that my life and my wife does not think me to be that kind of man, I'll give it up in a heartbeat. And he founded instead the Promise Keepers movement, which I still wear. Some of you sometimes come up and say, "What are you wearing that bracelet for?" It's pink. It says Promise Keepers on it. And sometimes people wear them out. So if I held it up to you, you could read it. But I have it where I read it, so that I try to never let that right hand go anywhere that I don't have to see those words before it lands on something. Dads, I'm not telling you to do it right now. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings up in here. Would you have the, I don't want to say guts either. It'll be on the radio someday. Do you have the internal fortitude to sit down with your wife, look her in the eye, and say, "What kind of man do you think I am?" And then wait long enough to let her answer? And ladies, do you have the internal fortitude to be honest enough that if your husband needs to do something different, you would tell him? Don't tell him, "Oh, you're a good man. You're a good provider." Wow. You're in it for the money? Surely not. That conversation probably needs to happen more often. Might need to happen at my house, but I'm not sure I have the internal fortitude to do it. That's all right. We've been married long enough. She just goes ahead and tells me. Ladies, if you don't get invited, just go ahead and tell them, because they're avoiding the inevitable. The last one, children are our real building. They become like famous buildings to an architect. We are known by and through our children. Dad, can I tell you something? If you tell your kids, "Don't ever go out in public and embarrass me," but you embarrass them at home, shut your mouth. Don't ever say that to your kids, because you're telling them right there you're putting up a front. If you tell your kids to not go out in public and do something that you in fact do at home, you ought to keep your mouth shut, because you're making a fool of yourself to your own children. Okay, I'm going to say this one more time, and at least a woman ought to say amen. Y'all have not got this figured out. Men, don't ever tell your kids to not go out and embarrass you when you do things at home that embarrass them. We weren't going to go through that again, were we? Wow. I just simply trying to drive home the point that facade, you live on both sides of it, but so do your kids. Man, and you know what? This is probably one of the hardest sermons. A sermon like this is one of the hardest sermons, because I can't even hardly look over that direction, because I got two kids going, "Man, I can't believe he's saying that. I can't believe he talks the way he talks," because they've had to grow up in a parsonage. And if it ain't real at home, then I'm a hypocrite to my own children. And I take it kind of serious. I thank God that I can stand here and point at them, because they're sitting in here.